This is Break It Down to the T, where we don't just review films, we diagnose them. Every character you've ever watched on screen, they have a mental condition. And we're here to name it, unpack it, and show you exactly how it plays out in the story. Think of us as the shrinks Hollywood never hired. Welcome to the couch. On today's couch, there's someone who got diagnosed by the entire universe already. Every single person watching this already thinks they've diagnosed Arthur Fleck. Reddit's had him figured out since 2019. He's just crazy. He's a psychopath. Cool. Very clinical of you, random guy with a fedora avatar. Except here's the thing nobody wants to hear. Crazy isn't a diagnosis. It's what people say when they don't want to do the actual homework. And Arthur did the homework for you. He kept a journal. He wrote his own symptoms down for 2 movies straight, and somehow the internet still walked away going, yeah, he's just evil, I guess. So today we're not doing the lazy read. We're pulling out the actual chart. And by the end of this, you're going to realize the scariest thing about Arthur Fleck was never the clown makeup. It was that every single warning sign was sitting right there in plain sight. And we all just really wanted him to be a monster instead of a patient. Let's start decoding, because Arthur's actual file is way more specific than he's crazy, and the movie hands you the paperwork itself if you're paying attention. The laughing. That's not creepy villain laugh for atmosphere. That's Arthur carrying an actual card in his wallet, explaining that his laughter is a condition, not an emotion. He hands it to a woman on the bus who's uncomfortable, and she doesn't even finish reading it before she looks at him like he's dangerous. That card is the movie telling you, directly. In text, this is real and this is documented, and society still doesn't have the patience to read past line 1. And here's the real-world comparison, because this isn't invented movie science. What Arthur's describing lines up with Pseudobulbar Affect, a real neurological condition where a person laughs or cries uncontrollably, completely disconnected from what they're actually feeling inside. It shows up in real patients with brain injuries, Mississippi, ALS, conditions that damage the pathways controlling emotional expression. So somebody with PBA might be terrified or devastated or in physical pain, and what comes out of their body is laughter, loud, sustained, impossible to stop on command. Now watch every scene where Arthur's laughing at the worst possible moment. Funerals, breakdowns, violence, and you realize the movie isn't showing you a villain enjoying chaos. It's showing you a man whose body is betraying his actual emotional state in real time, in front of people who have zero context and even less patience. That's the tragedy baked into the very first act, before anything violent even happens. Every single person Arthur interacts with reads his laughter as intent, as menace, as something's wrong with this guy, in the scary sense, not the medical sense. Nobody asks. Nobody reads the card past the first sentence. And that's not a coincidence. That's the exact real-world pattern people with PBA describe. Being met with fear or disgust in moments where they have zero physical control over what their face and body are doing. And then there's the delusional thread running underneath all of it, the relationship with Sophie down the hall, built up in his head as something reciprocal and real, when the film eventually shows you it mostly wasn't. That's not romantic obsession played for laughs. That's a man whose grip on consensus reality is already loosening, filling gaps in his actual, lonely life with a version of connection his brain needed to survive. Combine an uncontrollable physical symptom that gets him branded a threat everywhere he goes, with a mind slowly building its own more bearable version of reality, and you don't get a monster. You get someone the system had 10 different chances to catch, and every single time chose to see the laugh instead of the diagnosis underneath it. Let's move to the part of the file everybody skips past because it's boring compared to the clown makeup, the scene in the social worker's office. Arthur sits there, same tired room, same caseworker, and says the line that's basically the thesis of this whole movie without anyone in the room clocking it. Nobody listens, he says. And then, the actual gut punch, the city's cutting the program entirely. 7 counselors down to 0. No more sessions. No more meds refills. That's not a side detail. That's the plot mechanism. This isn't a man who spirals because he's inherently evil. It's a man whose one remaining thread of external stability gets cut, on camera, by an underfunded system that was never built to actually catch him. And here's the comparison that matters. Because mental health professionals have talked about this scene specifically as one of the more accurate portrayals of what happens when psychiatric care gets treated as optional infrastructure instead of essential care. In the real world, abrupt medication discontinuation, especially with antipsychotics or mood stabilizers, can trigger something called rebound psychosis. Symptoms returning harder and faster than before treatment ever started, precisely because the brain had been chemically stabilized and then had that stability yanked out from under it overnight. Arthur doesn't get a slow, dramatic villain transformation. He gets what real patients describe: a chemical rug pull, dressed up in the movie as one quiet, unremarkable office scene that most first-time viewers barely register. Now here's where Folie Deux actually enters the file. And it's not just a fancy French title wrong universe, Todd Phillips picked because it sounded cool. Folie Deux is an actual documented psychiatric phenomenon, shared psychotic disorder, where one person's delusion gets transmitted to and reinforced by someone close to them, usually someone isolated, dependent, or already vulnerable themselves. It's rare, but it's real. And it almost always requires one dominant personality supplying the delusion and one more suggestible person absorbing it as truth. That's the entire back half of this story. Arthur doesn't just become Joker in isolation. He becomes Joker inside a relationship, with someone willing to believe the myth right alongside him, feeding it, performing it back to him, making the delusion feel less like a private break and more like a shared reality two people built together. And that's the twist nobody wants to sit with. This was never a solo diagnosis. Every previous Joker breakdown online treats Arthur like a one-man case study, isolated psychosis, isolated villain origin. But Folie Deux only works with two participants, which means the actual chilling read here isn't one man broke. It's one broken man found somebody willing to break right alongside him. And once you've got two people validating the same delusion back and forth, it stops looking like madness to either of them. It starts looking, from the inside, like the only version of reality that's ever made sense. Let's talk about the ending, because this is where Folie Deux stops being a cool clinical term and starts being the saddest diagnosis in the whole movie. Shared psychotic disorder has a very specific, very unglamorous failure mode in real cases. And it's this: the moment the two people get separated, physically or emotionally, the dependent partner's delusion often collapses first, because it was never fully their own to begin with. It was borrowed, propped up by proximity to the dominant personality supplying it. And that's exactly what the courtroom sequence shows you, except in reverse of what everyone expected. Lee's the one who walks away clear-eyed. Arthur's the one left holding a version of Joker that was never entirely his to keep. Watch the scene where she visits him after everything's fallen apart, and tell me that's not a woman who's already exited the shared delusion, looking at a man still standing inside it, alone now, performing a version of himself for an audience that stopped showing up. That's the real clinical tragedy underneath the courtroom theatrics. Folie Deux doesn't usually end in some big dramatic joint reveal. It ends quietly, one person waking up first, and the other one left mid-performance, still convinced the show's still running. And then there's the stabbing. Everybody online treats this as shock value, a last-minute gut punch to mess with the sequel-baiting crowd. But diagnostically, it's the most honest beat in the entire film. Because once the shared delusion breaks, once Arthur's sitting there without Lee, without the crowd, without anyone left to reflect the myth back at him, what's actually left underneath is exactly what we opened this whole video with: an unstable, undiagnosed, undertreated man whose laughing condition was never the scary part. His isolation was. And the movie's final answer to who is the real Joker isn't Arthur. It's whoever's sitting across from him in that room, someone unstable enough, unmonitored enough, uncontained enough to pick up exactly where the myth left off. The disorder was never the man. It was the vacancy he left behind. And vacancies, unlike people, don't get therapy. That's the part that should actually keep you up at night, more than any clown makeup ever could. This wasn't a story about one broken man breaking worse. It was a story about a system that failed to treat him, a delusion that briefly gave him the connection that system never offered, and an ending that proves the disorder was never contained to Arthur Fleck specifically. It was contained to every room he was ever asked to sit in alone, waiting for help that got defunded before it ever had the chance to actually reach him. All right, let's land this thing. Verdict time. Because after all that, the real diagnosis isn't Pseudobulbar Affect, and it isn't Folie Deux either. Not really. Those are just the two entry points the movie uses to walk you toward the actual conclusion, which is way less comfortable than either fancy term. The real disorder on trial in this movie is neglect. Institutional, personal, generational neglect, stacked so high that by the time Arthur's laughing on that bus, he's not the beginning of the story. He's the ending of about a dozen other stories nobody bothered to follow up on.
Think about everyone who had a chance to actually catch this. The caseworker who admits nobody's listening right before the funding gets pulled entirely. The mother who apparently knew exactly what kind of environment Arthur grew up in and said nothing for decades. The talk show host who used a man's most vulnerable, unfiltered moment as content, as a punchline, because it was good television. Every single one of these people had a door they could have opened. Every single one of them closed it instead. Sometimes out of cruelty, sometimes out of exhaustion, sometimes just out of a system that made closing the door the path of least resistance. Arthur isn't an anomaly the movie invents to shock you. He's what happens when every single safety net gets quietly removed one thread at a time, and nobody notices until there's nothing left to catch anyone. And that's why Folie Deux is such a genius title for the sequel specifically, because by that point, the madness of Two isn't just Arthur and Lee anymore. It's Arthur and an entire city that built him, misdiagnosed him, defunded him, mythologized him, and then acted shocked when the myth didn't behave the way they wanted it to in a courtroom. Two participants sharing a delusion. Except zoom out far enough, and the second participant was never just one woman in a psych ward. It was everyone who looked at a documented, card-holding, help-seeking man and decided crazy was an easier word to reach for than failed. So here's the actual verdict, and it's not the one Reddit gave him back in 2019. Arthur Fleck was never a monster who happened to also be sick. He was a patient the entire system diagnosed correctly on paper, and then abandoned in practice, over and over, until the gap between what he needed and what he got became so wide that a laugh turned into a legend, and a legend turned into a body count nobody in the story was ever equipped or honestly willing to prevent. Good call. For 30 minutes, we need more meat before that outro, not after it. Let's slide this in as a new section, the musical sequences, something the previous 500-word blocks skipped completely. I'll move the outro to close after this instead. Let's talk about the songs, because everybody treats those musical breaks like style, like Todd Phillips just wanted a jukebox musical vibe for a sequel. Wrong read. Watch what's actually happening structurally. Every single musical number shows up exactly when reality gets too heavy for Arthur to process directly. Not randomly, not for spectacle. Every time. Here's the mechanism. What Arthur's doing in those sequences lines up almost exactly with something called maladaptive daydreaming, a real, documented condition where a person retreats into vivid, immersive fantasy, specifically as a coping response to trauma, isolation, or unbearable present-moment reality. It's not the same as psychosis, and that distinction matters a lot here, because in maladaptive daydreaming, the person usually still knows, on some level, that the fantasy isn't real. It's an escape hatch, not a break from reality. Which tracks perfectly with the songs, because they always arrive at the exact moment the actual scene becomes too much. The courtroom collapsing, Lee's betrayal, the isolation setting back in, and Arthur's mind quite literally changes the channel to something with lighting, a spotlight, an audience that loves him. And here's the detail most people miss, because they're too busy either loving or hating the musical format. The fantasies get less polished as the film goes on. Early on, they're glossy, full production value, an idealized world where Arthur's adored and in control. By the back half, they start glitching. The crowd disappears, the lighting dims, Lee's presence in them gets shakier and less certain. That's not inconsistent filmmaking. That's the escape hatch itself failing in real time. Because maladaptive daydreaming works best when there's still enough hope left to fuel the fantasy. Once the shared delusion with Lee starts collapsing in reality, the fantasy world doesn't have the raw material to sustain itself either. The songs aren't just Arthur performing, they're a live readout of how much psychological fuel he's got left. Now for the real-world grounding, because this pattern shows up in actual case literature on trauma and dissociative coping, particularly in people with severe, prolonged childhood abuse, which the film has already established Arthur endured. Clinicians who study maladaptive daydreaming consistently note it develops earliest and most intensely in children who had no safe outlet for real connection or control, so the mind builds one internally instead. Arthur's musical numbers aren't a directorial flourish bolted onto a comic book movie. They're the on-screen visualization of exactly the coping mechanism his own backstory would predict. A boy with nobody safe to turn to, building himself an audience that could never let him down, right up until even his own imagination stops being able to promise him that. Let's give Lee her own file, because so far she's only existed in this breakdown as the other half of the delusion, and that's actually underselling what she is diagnostically. Watch her specifically, separate from Arthur, and a different pattern emerges entirely. Lee doesn't fall for Arthur. She falls for Joker, specifically the myth version, before she's even fully met the man underneath it. She knows the tabloid story. She's seeking him out, engineering the meeting, performing recognition of Joker before Arthur's even decided to fully become him again. That ordering matters, clinically, because it points towards something specific: hybristophilia, a real, documented attraction pattern where a person becomes romantically or sexually drawn to someone specifically because of violent or criminal notoriety, not despite it. It's rare, it's real, and it's been studied extensively in cases involving high-profile offenders who receive fan mail, marriage proposals, obsessive followers, all built around the crime itself as the draw, not incidental to it. Here's what makes Lee's version so unsettling once you see it. She's not attracted to Arthur's vulnerability, his laughing condition, his loneliness, the actual man in the actual room. She's attracted to the legend that formed around the murders, the mask, the movement he accidentally started. Which means the entire relationship, from her side, was never really about connecting with a person at all. It was about proximity to a myth she already loved, before she ever loved him. And that reframes the whole Folie Deux read from earlier in a way that should genuinely unsettle you. A shared delusion requires two people building the same false reality together. But what if only one of them actually needed it to be real? Arthur needed Joker to survive, needed the myth as an escape hatch from decades of neglect. Lee needed Joker as an aesthetic, a story to attach herself to, a version of danger she could opt into, and, crucially, opt back out of. That's exactly what the ending shows you. She walks, cleanly. Because her attraction was never to Arthur specifically, it was to the character. And once the character stopped performing, there was nothing left tethering her to the actual broken man sitting across from her. So here's the twist inside the twist. This wasn't two people sharing one delusion equally. This was one man who needed the fantasy to keep breathing, and one woman who was borrowing it for the thrill, with an exit already built in from day one. And that asymmetry, more than the songs, more than the courtroom, more than the stabbing, might be the single saddest diagnosis in the whole film. Arthur wasn't just failed by a system. He was failed by the one person the story convinced him, and convinced us, actually saw him. That's a wrap on Arthur Fleck's file. Undiagnosed for decades, misread by everyone who had the power to actually help, and finally handed a mirror in Lee that turned out to be borrowed too. The scariest thing in this whole movie was never the makeup. It was how many people had a chance to open that door and just didn't. Let me know down in the comments which patient hit hardest for you today. The laughing, the courtroom, the songs, or Lee's exit. And if you're new here, go hit subscribe, because we've got 6 more patients from the Odyssey dropping this week, and Arthur's file isn't the last couch we're opening. This has been Break It Down to the T. Stay diagnosed.